Hello, my name is Louise Brown. I'm the Creative Learning Officer at the Citizens Theatre. And I'm joined here this morning by novelist Philip Caveney, who also writes under the pen name of Danny Weston. And it's as Danny Weston that he wrote the book The Piper, which recently won the 2016 Scottish Children's Book Award. And we're here really to talk to an expert about what makes a great horror story. But as we were speaking before, we talked about supernatural thriller, and think that that's a really interesting way of thinking about the work that Philip has written.
Yeah, because I think there's a basic difference. When you talk about horror, you think of like the Darren Shan kind of book that's full of bloodshed and that kind of stuff. I think a supernatural thriller is more subtle. It's about atmosphere, it's about chills, it's about making the hairs on your back of your neck stand up.
So if we think about the sort of really vital ingredients of a horrific supernatural thriller, what would you talk about?
I would talk about, I would always start in the same way that any piece of fiction you're writing begins with the characters. I think characters are fundamentally the most important aspect of any piece of fiction. You have to create good characters, characters that you can make the readers care about.
And how do you make people care about these characters?
I think the first thing to bear in mind is to give them problems to solve. There is nothing more tedious than reading about somebody who's in a wonderful position, who's just won the lottery and everybody loves them. That's boring. We have to give them things to overcome, and that can be problems in their life. If they're young people, maybe they're being bullied, maybe they're lonely, maybe they're coping with the death of a parent or a cousin or something like that. All those things will instantly make us think, we want this person to succeed.
What about the kind of situation, the sort of story itself? What might you bear in mind if you're approaching something that's a supernatural thriller? Well, you've got your character, they've got obstacles already. What are the other important elements of that sort of situation or story?
I think we have to challenge them with something that's inexplicable. I mean, we've all had situations in our life, maybe smaller ones, where, we've lost something and we spend the whole day looking and then we turn around and it's right beside us. And that makes you think, ooh, how did that happen? Well, I think when you write a supernatural thriller, you're amplifying those same elements. You're making it bigger. You're making it something like, it could be a ghost, if we can use the G word. It could be something that they just cannot explain.
You talked a bit before about a hook, and getting something that happens quite early on, which is intriguing or interesting for the reader and makes people want to read on. Say a bit more about that.
I think it's really important. I mean, in chapter 1, I always put something in there which is designed primarily to hook people in and make them think, oh, I've got to find out what happens in chapter 2. And if you do it properly, there should be one virtually in every chapter that will make them read on. In The Piper, for instance, we have a boy who's going to a lonely house in a lonely sort of setting, and he encounters a woman on the path, and the woman doesn't speak to him. She's just staring at the house, and when he speaks to her, she looks, and she's wearing a hood, and he cannot see her face, but he can feel her eyes burning into him, and he immediately hurries on his way. And I hope that's enough to make people think, OK, who is the woman? Why is she there in the dead of night? What does she have to do with the story as it progresses?
So we're immediately thinking about the atmosphere, I guess, and how to create a mysterious, intriguing kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, I think it's particularly important in a ghost story. Setting is so important for that. I particularly set this book in a place called Romney Marsh, which is down in the south of England, a huge wilderness of just swamp and hardly any trees you can see for miles. There are mists that come in off the waters, And I thought that I would get that sort of convincing scenario where your audience is then more likely to accept these incredible things happening because they've already felt a sense of unease about where it is set.
And you think that actually having that helps you write your story in the first place. It's easier to write a frightening story if you've got a potentially frightening location rather than somewhere really ordinary.
I agree. I mean, it's particularly in a ghost story. I mean, one of the hardest things, and I'm not saying it's impossible because of course it can be done, but if you set your story in a block of flats in a modern environment, it's much, much harder to get people to suspend their belief enough to accept that these incredibly scary things can happen.
We talked a little bit about sort of like the structure, and you were saying that you don't really think so much about that. If you're writing a novel, it's a more extended piece of writing, and you can let your characters lead the way a little bit. But also if it's a short story, it's obviously all the action's got to happen in a more disciplined type time frame. What would you say about that and bearing that in mind in terms of when you're structuring it?
Well, definitely with the short story, you cannot expend too many words. You've got to keep everything concise. So it would be a case of introducing your characters, which is very, very important. Put them in a situation where they are, and then what we call a story arc. And it's got to be very contained for a short story. We don't have, pages and pages to spend. And we have to have what the posh writers call a denouement, which just means an ending. But that must in some way have changed the characters. If the characters are exactly the same as when they started out, something's wrong. They must have learned something from this experience. They must have changed in some way, and that's very important.
So they've got a problem in their life to begin with. That makes us kind of empathise with them.
Yes.
Then other things happen to them, perhaps in this kind of supernatural realm, or, something happens which makes things more difficult for them. They maybe try and work it out.
Yes.
And by the end, does everything have to have a tied-up resolution or not?
See, endings are a sore point. I mean, your publishers will always tell you, make sure you don't make the ending too grim. And I've had battles in the past where I've wanted a particular ending and they said, no, that's too grim. Generally, you can find a way to do it. I'm not somebody who's known for sweetness and light at the ends of my books. And the Piper, for instance, has, I think, a satisfactory ending, but it's quite grim in many ways. And I won't spoil it by going into detail. But there was a certain amount of tussling with the publishers to get the ending that I felt the book needed.
That's interesting. So things don't always have to be answered, and they don't have to be in any way positive because of the nature of the short story.
No. And of course, the thing to avoid at all costs is to have the Waltons kind of ending where everybody says, they're all standing around laughing. What a funny thing that was. But it's all back to normal now. Because I think that's unsatisfying. It's unsatisfying. It doesn't happen in real life. So maybe don't let that happen in your fiction.
Yeah. I suppose that's also continuing the whole idea of the atmosphere and the tone of this, which is...
Yes.
It's a thriller. It's a mystery.
It's a thriller. It's a mystery. We have to... I mean, my major aim with the Piper was to get the kind of book that would make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And that's exactly what I went for. And, you do that by creating atmosphere. There's a very important thing that writers talk about, which is called show, don't tell. And this is very important. When you are telling your story, and I've used the word telling there, but what you mustn't do is just tell it as though it's happening off at a distance, way over in the horizon. What we want is to see it through the eyes of the character, as though it's happening now, it's happening for real, and we are sharing that experience with the characters.
Could you give us an example of that, like you did earlier?
Okay, well, for instance... a little scenario. John was walking along the street one day and he called into a newsagent's shop and he went in and he bought a packet of crisps and he came out again. That is telling it. Okay. That's deadly. But if it's, as John walked down the street that morning, he was feeling really happy about what had happened to him the night before. He called into the shop and saw his old friend Ahmed behind the counter and said, "How are you this morning?" "I'm pretty good." "What's happening with you?" "I see your football team isn't doing too well." After that, he bought himself a packet of cheese and onion Monster Munch and he left and he went out. And immediately it's more interesting. You're more engaged with the characters. I found out, for instance, that he likes Monster Munch, that he's got a good friend called Ahmed. And, there we go. We've got a lot more information in there.
Yeah, more dynamic, more vital as well. And you care about whatever's going to happen to John.
Yes.
Which probably isn't very good.
No. In this scenario, it probably won't be good.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, what are your top tips for developing a sort of original or unusual idea for a story?
Well, the first... I keep coming back to character, I know, because that's so important. But voice... The author's voice. It's the way you tell your story that will make it special. I mean, the truth is that most stories have been told in one form or another over the years. What you have to do is try and develop your own way of telling the story. And you do that by telling it in your voice. You find a way of doing it. And the other thing I would say is don't be afraid to rewrite. Sometimes people hold up their hands in horror when I say this, but nobody gets it right the first time. Every one of my books, I've published 40-odd books now, every one of them is written at least 3 times. I write the whole thing, I go through it again, and really I do a major rewrite, and then I do a fine-tune, and then it's ready to show to the publishers.
It's really interesting. Could you say a little bit more about how you develop your own voice and what you even mean by that?
It's kind of hard, because I'll tell you the truth of it is... I got the urge to write when I was 13. I read a book by Ray Bradbury called Something Wicked This Way Comes. I was at a horrible boarding school, and I thought, I want to do this with my life. Most of the things I then started to write were like Ray Bradbury books, watered down, not as good, obviously, because he was a genius and I was a 13-year-old kid. But it took time to find my own voice, and you do that by writing and writing and just trying to rewrite things and find your own little way of telling it, adding your own observations to it. That's what will give you a distinct voice. Of course, in terms of a competition like this, there probably isn't the time, but those kids out there who do have that urge to write must understand this, that it takes a long time. I call it an apprenticeship. I probably spent 10 years trying to get my first book published, 10 years writing stuff, having it rejected, writing something else, having it rejected, and finally one day, 1977, I think, the year of punk, it finally happened. So, and that's because I developed my voice over that time. Now, I know in a situation like we've got, we don't have that much time to develop the voice, but always be thinking of your unique slant, the way you can make this story your own by putting your own personal voice to it.
That's brilliant. I mean, one of the things we talked about is not only in terms of your style, but if people want to use Glaswegian dialect or the way they actually speak, feel free to do that if that seems appropriate for the story, Oh,
yes, I think that's really important, particularly if you, in this case, where we've got a really famous story that's actually set in Glasgow,
In terms of, actually getting started, sometimes it can be hard. Once you put pen to paper and you think lots of ideas, none of them are good enough. Have you got anything that you think is a bit of advice for actually getting started?
Well, there's a technique I use, and I've used it for years. And this is how, if I don't have a specific idea to start with, I imagine I've just walked into a cinema or a theatre, like this beautiful theatre we're sitting in now, and I picture in my mind's eye a screen. Okay, and I just take a seat wherever I want, and I concentrate on the screen, and I imagine the lights going down, and I look at that screen in my head, and I wait for an image to appear on it, and I've used it many times, and that image, you don't know what it's going to be, but then you write something about that and see what develops from it. There will be a character in that image, hopefully. Usually you'll see the character who you think is going to be the main character in your story, and maybe that character is with somebody else who's also going to be important, and maybe there's a conversation going on, but that's the starting point.
That's interesting. That's kind of, in a way, that's letting yourself relax enough, isn't it, to come up with something and not pressurising yourself too much.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
I think the other thing, of course, is we all see stuff all the time. I mean, we might see something in the paper and think, oh, that'll make a good story. Well, that's an interesting angle. What's important there is to make a note of that and don't forget it, because, then you can come at it and imagine yourself as one of the characters in this situation you've seen. The hardest thing to write is the first line. I always say this, that I do writing classes in schools. I say that it's going to be so hard to write that first sentence, but the second sentence will be easier. The third one will be easier still. By the time you're halfway down the page, you'll be flowing. And if you need to, think about going back and restarting it and, maybe rewriting those first few lines and getting them better. But get the thing flowing. Get yourself into the mindset of the character you're talking about.
It's brilliant. I'm going to ask you, what little bit of advice do you know that you wish you'd known when you first started? What little nugget of information as a successful writer?
Well, I suppose the thing I would think to myself is I wish I'd written for younger readers earlier than I did, because my first 12 books were written for adults, and there's nothing wrong with adults, don't get me wrong. But when you write for younger readers, you have the opportunity to go into the schools and meet them and talk to them and get their reactions to your work, which you don't tend to get when you write for an older age group. Maybe you go to a Waterstones every 6 months and you see a bunch of people and you read to them and they sign books, and that's it, and that's your involvement. I actually got into writing because my daughter, who was 8, writing for younger children, I should say. She was 8 years old. She wanted to read a thriller I'd written, which was totally unsuitable for her. And I panicked and said I would write something for her. And I wrote a book called Sebastian Dart, which sold in, I think, 20 countries around the world. It's far and away the most successful book series I've ever been involved in. I kind of have her to thank for it. I wish I'd found that calling earlier.
So knowing your audience is actually interesting then, isn't it? Thinking about who you're writing for.
Oh, yeah. And I think I said this to you before about the protagonist. If you're going to write for that age, find a protagonist at the right age for the people who are going to be reading your story. Very important that. I mean, if you're writing for 14 and 15-year-olds, then have a 14 or 15-year-old protagonist there. Don't make it a 48-year-old man, because the audience will have less in common with that, you know. And I think that's very important to tailor that to your audience, your perceived audience.
Brilliant. We've covered a lot of ground. I don't know if there's anything left to say. Have you got any final words of encouragement for budding fantasy, horror, thriller writers?
I have, and it's quite simple, really. Number one, if you think you can do this and you really, really want to do it, don't let anything deter you. You have to give it the best shot. You only get one chance in life to do the thing you love. So, and there'll be people queuing up to tell you you can't do it. Don't listen to them. Keep going. If somebody turns down your work, write something else and send that out. And that's really important. Don't give up on it. And the other thing is, the 3 major rules of writing are these: rewrite, rewrite, and rewrite. If you do it 3 times, you're sure that before you send a thing off, it's as good as it possibly can be, then you're halfway there.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.